rain had fallen without pause all evening, a steady curtain of water that muffled the world into a hushed, uneasy silence. The great house of Sir Clithering stood apart on the edge of a windswept moor, its windows glowing faintly through the storm, as though reluctant to offer warmth. Inside, the dinner party had ended hours ago, the laughter and polite conversation dissolving into awkward good nights as the guests departed into the night, leaving their host alone. Or so it was thought. When the butler, a nervous fellow named Hadwell, rose at dawn to draw the curtains of the drawing-room, he stopped short and gave a strangled cry. There, in the middle of the rug, lay Sir Clithering himself, his body sprawled, his face oddly peaceful, his eyes wide open as though arrested mid-thought. Nothing seemed disturbed. The fire had burned down to embers, the windows were locked from within, and the heavy oak door bore its bolt firmly in place. Not a single object was overturned. Not a sound of struggle had been heard during the long storm. Yet Sir Clithering was dead. The police were called swiftly, their motor car splashing across the sodden moor roads until it came crunching to a halt in the gravel drive. Inspector Cray, a square-jawed man with a habit of chewing at his moustache when perplexed, entered the room with methodical care. He crouched beside the body, his lantern eyes narrowing. "No marks," he murmured. "No wound, no sign of poison, no glass, no vial. A man does not simply die like this." It was Hadwell who pointed out the first and only clue, his voice trembling. "There, sir, at his side, on the carpet." And indeed there lay a playing card, a queen of hearts, spotless and gleaming as though it had been placed with deliberate intent. Inspector Cray frowned. A card, and nothing more. The pockets of the dead man were neatly arranged, no missing watch, no sign of robbery. The house itself was secure, its doors and windows bolted from within, the locks untouched. A locked room, a corpse without a mark, and a card, ridiculous in its simplicity, left as if mocking the very idea of explanation. Sir Clithering, in life, had been a man both admired and feared. A financier of uncanny instinct, he had multiplied his fortune a dozen times over, though not without enemies. It was whispered that men had gone to ruin because of him, that fortunes and reputations had been trampled underfoot while he climbed higher. Yet, for all his ruthless cunning in business, he lived curiously alone. His only companions, his books, his papers, and the occasional gathering of society guests, such as the one the night before. Inspector Cray wasted no time in questioning those who had dined at the house. Each one told a similar tale. The evening had passed without incident. Sir Clithering had seemed in fine spirits, almost buoyant, raising a toast to paradoxes, whatever that might have meant. He had laughed more than usual, though some remarked his laughter rang hollow. No quarrels, no whispers of ill temper. At the end of the night he had bid his guests farewell with impeccable courtesy. By the time they departed, Sir Clithering had been entirely alone in his house, save for Hadwell and a maid who had retired early. No one had returned. No one had entered. And yet the man was dead. The oddity of the playing card gnawed at Inspector Cray. Why a queen of hearts? He turned it over, sniffed it, even held it to the light. No scent of chemicals, no trace of tampering. Clean as though plucked from a fresh deck. Yet Hadwell swore there had been no cards on the table the night before, nor in the room at all. Sir Clithering did not gamble, and was not known for games of any kind. Still, there it lay, undeniable. By noon the storm had lifted, leaving the moors washed in silver mist. Villagers gathered at the edge of the lane, murmuring of the mystery in the great house. Some whispered of spirits, others of vengeance long delayed. The talk grew thick and speculative, and it was in that atmosphere of confusion that a small, elderly lady appeared at the gates, her umbrella neatly furled despite the damp, her eyes keen though she moved with gentle modesty. Miss Marple had arrived to visit her goddaughter in the next village, and, hearing the commotion, had paused to listen. When she was told of Sir Clithering's death, her brows lifted ever so slightly, and she murmured that it was most curious indeed. Somehow, though none could later explain how, she was soon inside the drawing-room itself, standing with quiet composure beside Inspector Cray. He explained the matter to her briskly, more out of courtesy than expectation, but found himself oddly comforted by her calm. She listened attentively, her eyes never straying far from the Queen of Hearts. "A paradox, you said?" she remarked softly, recalling the toast from the evening before. "And a Queen of Hearts. Oh yes, Inspector, there is a paradox here indeed. The question is not how Sir Clithering died, but why he should wish us to think of love when he himself had little of it." Inspector Cray blinked, taken aback. "You mean the card was placed by him?" Miss Marple only smiled faintly. "Or by someone who understood him very well? But if so, then the room is not quite as locked as it appears. You see, locked rooms are rarely truly locked. It is usually the imagination that is sealed shut, not the door." And with that gentle, troubling thought, the mystery of Sir Clithering's death deepened, every detail entangled in contradiction. A man dead without a mark, a card with no meaning, a toast to paradoxes echoing like a challenge from the grave. The paradox of Sir Clithering had only begun. The air in the drawing-room had turned heavy with the scent of extinguished fire and polished oak, a solemn chamber now guarded by the silence of death. Inspector Cray stood stiffly near the hearth, his notebook already thick with scrawled testimony, his brow furrowed into deeper lines with every unanswered question. The constable hovered awkwardly near the door, as though reluctant to be in the same room with the corpse. Miss Marple, however, moved with the soft certainty of one who had long since grown accustomed to the small telling oddities that life or death had to offer. She bent slightly, her eyes falling once more on the Queen of Hearts, the single piece of evidence that had confounded the inspector. She did not touch it, only studied its placement, precisely aligned with the dead man's right hand, though not close enough to have been dropped casually. It had been arranged, quite deliberately. "It is curious, Inspector," she murmured. "When people intend to send a message, they rarely choose a symbol beyond their own comprehension. Yet this card, it speaks, but we do not yet know in what tongue." Cray gave a grunt. "I've men checking his papers. Perhaps he played cards in secret." But, even as he said it, his voice lacked conviction. His instinct told him the clue was a red herring, but instinct alone was a weak tool in the face of so thorough a puzzle. Miss Marple drifted to the writing desk near the window, a broad mahogany piece that bore a tidy array of papers, an inkstand, and a brass lamp. She observed without touching, noting the curious absence of dust along the front edge, as though something had lately been removed. A square outline lingered faintly in the polish, an object once there, no longer in place. "I wonder, Inspector," she said softly, "whether Sir Clithering was in the habit of keeping a photograph here. One would expect in such a household at least a likeness of some kind. Men who live alone are often sentimental in their private corners, though not before others." Cray frowned. "If there was one, it's gone now." He signalled to his constable, who began an uneasy search through the drawers. Nothing surfaced, no portrait, no keepsake, only ledgers, business correspondence, and carefully folded documents. Miss Marple's eyes moved next to the hearthrug beneath Sir Clithering's body. The pattern of the rug was fine, but one corner, near the desk, bore a faint dampness, as though a shoe had carried in water. "Forgive me, Inspector, but might I trouble you to recall the storm last night? If Sir Clithering did not leave the house, then whose shoe was wet?" Cray's eyes snapped downward. He had missed it, though it lay plain to see once pointed out. "Hadwell swore no one came in after the guests departed," he muttered, "and the doors were locked, unless—" He did not finish, but the thought pressed itself heavy between them. The butler, summoned back for further questioning, stood pale and anxious at the doorway. Miss Marple observed him with a gentleness that belied the sharpness of her scrutiny. "You must forgive us, Mr. Hadwell," she said kindly. "But do tell me, was Sir Clithering quite alone? After the guests left, you did not see anyone linger?" "No, madam," Hadwell stammered. "I locked the doors myself. Sir Clithering went to the drawing-room and I retired soon after. He dismissed me early." His eyes flicked nervously to the body before dropping away. "He was quite well then." "And yet," Miss Marple said softly, "his carpet tells another tale. Someone stood here, Mr. Hadwell, someone who had braved the rain." The butler swallowed hard, his hands twisting together. I know nothing of it, I swear. The doors were bolted. No one could have entered." Inspector Cray cut in sharply. "Unless they were already inside." His gaze hardened on the man. But Miss Marple merely tilted her head, noting how the butler's fear seemed less that of guilt and more that of a man who dreaded suspicion falling upon him. She turned instead to the windows. They were locked, as Cray had said, but she saw now a thin streak along the inside of the sill, a trace of moisture where none should be. She said nothing at first, only observed, her thoughts moving swiftly behind her calm expression. Someone had opened it during the storm, perhaps only briefly, before locking it again. But why? Not to escape, for the ground below was sodden earth that would bear footprints plainly. Yet no prints had been found outside this morning. A paradox indeed. By afternoon the coroner arrived, his examination producing no clearer cause of death. No injury, no sign of struggle. Heart simply ceased. He shrugged, baffled. But I'll not call it natural, not with that card there. The inspector pressed on with his questioning, summoning the maid, the gardener, even the coachman who had driven the guests home. All denied knowledge, their accounts consistent. Yet Miss Marple noticed one small thing. When the maid was asked about the previous evening, her eyes flitted not to the body but to the desk just for a fraction of a moment, a glance quickly suppressed, yet too revealing for Miss Marple's watchful gaze to miss. "Thank you, my dear," she said gently, after the girl had answered. "And you did not return to the drawing-room at all after retiring?" The maid shook her head too quickly. "No, miss. I went straight upstairs." Her fingers worried at her apron as she spoke. Miss Marple let it rest for the moment. She knew well the futility of pressing too hard too soon. Instead, she took a slow step nearer the desk again, her eyes falling once more on the faint square in the polish, where a photograph might have been. And she thought of the card, the Queen of Hearts. Love, affection, or perhaps betrayal in matters of the heart. As dusk fell, the drawing-room grew dim, and Inspector Cray, weary and short of patience, declared the matter one for careful forensics. He would send for experts, he said. Miss Marple only nodded, but in her mind the pieces were already arranging themselves in subtle patterns. She saw now that Sir Clithering's death was not a crime of passion, nor one of greed alone. It was a crime of careful planning, of symbolic gesture. The playing card was not random. It was the first word in a sentence not yet complete. The missing photograph, the damp rug, the maid's nervous glance, each whispered of a hand that had touched the scene, a hand that sought to hide and yet, through carelessness or arrogance, betrayed itself. Miss Marple leaned closer to Sir Clithering's still face, as though in quiet conversation with the dead. "You raised a toast to paradoxes, sir," she murmured softly. "Perhaps the greatest paradox is that in dying you may yet speak louder than in life." And in that moment, though the mystery was far from solved, she knew the truth was already present in the room, like a figure hidden in a puzzle picture, invisible until one knew where to look. The drawing-room, though quieter by evening, still held the weight of the day's inquiry. The constables had gone about their duties with heavy boots and clipped words, but it was the conversations, the shifting tones, the careful evasions, that seemed to interest Miss Marple most of all. She sat unobtrusively in a high-backed chair, her knitting needles at rest in her lap, her eyes kind and unassuming. Yet each flicker of expression, each too-hurried word from those questioned, seemed to catch and linger in her mind like burrs on a walking skirt. Inspector Cray, though not ungifted, favoured blunt questioning. He summoned the guests who had remained in the village, and one by one they entered the sombre room where Sir Clithering still lay, now covered respectfully with a sheet. Their words filled the house with fragments of recollection, each shard reflecting a slightly different picture of the same evening. The first to be questioned was Mr. Giles Fenwick, a stout man whose manner combined geniality with a faintly defensive bluster. He claimed to have left immediately after the toast, offering Sir Clithering his thanks for the evening, before braving the storm with his wife. The old fellow was in remarkable spirits, Fenwick said, his hands folded across his middle. Jovial, almost. Well, I dare say he'd had a touch too much wine. Still, there was nothing amiss. Miss Marple's soft voice interjected, "Forgive me, Mr. Fenwick, but you said Sir Clithering was jovial. Yet I was told by Mrs. Lytton he seemed a trifle distracted, as though something pressed upon his mind. Might it be that his mood shifted during the evening?" Fenwick blinked. "Did she say that?" "Humph. Well, perhaps. Though between ourselves, Mrs. Lytton thrives on perceiving undercurrents where none exist." His chuckle was forced, his eyes sliding away. Next came Mrs. Lytton herself, tall, angular, her face sharp as cut glass. She was eager, almost too eager to lend her recollections. Sir Clithering was not himself, she declared. I saw it plainly. He laughed, yes, but it was a laughter to cover unease, and he spoke of paradoxes in a tone that chilled me, as though he mocked not us, but himself. Mark my words, Inspector, he had an enemy, and I should not be surprised if it were someone close at hand. She glanced meaningfully at Fenwick, who bristled but said nothing. Miss Marple caught the glance and tucked it away. Rivalries and resentments were seeds often hidden beneath the soil, waiting for the smallest disturbance to rise. When Mrs. Fenwick was questioned, she presented a softer, more hesitant account. Her voice trembled as she said, I thought Sir Clithering seemed, well, lonely, if I may put it so. He welcomed us warmly, but his eyes kept straying to the desk. It was as though something there troubled him. She faltered, then quickly added, But I am sure it was nothing. Miss Marple gave her a kindly smile. Sometimes it is the smallest things that weigh most heavily, my dear. Did you see what it was that drew his gaze? Mrs. Fenwick flushed, twisting her handkerchief. No, nothing at all. But her unease told another story, and Miss Marple noted how her husband's jaw tightened as she spoke. Then there was Captain Arkwright, a broad-shouldered man with an officer's bearing, his every sentence clipped and efficient. The evening was entirely ordinary, he said firmly. I left directly after dinner. If Sir Clithering was uneasy, I saw no sign. Talk of paradoxes is hardly unusual. He liked to speak in riddles, that was his way. His tone was steady, but his eyes never quite settled, darting between Inspector Cray and Miss Marple, as though calculating what they perceived. Finally came young Miss Helena Price, Sir Clithering's goddaughter, who had been among the guests. She entered pale, her hands clasped tightly. Her grief seemed genuine, yet when asked about the evening, her answers were curiously restrained. Uncle was kind, she said simply, but he seemed resolved about something, as though a decision had been made. I cannot say more. Inspector Cray pressed her. What decision? I do not know. She shook her head, though Miss Marple noticed the girl's voice quavered on the denial, and that she avoided looking toward the desk altogether. When the questioning ended, Cray rubbed at his moustache with growing irritation. Contradictions, half-truths, evasions. One says he was merry, another claims he was troubled. One saw him look at the desk, others did not, and all deny knowledge of that cursed card. Miss Marple's tone was calm, thoughtful. Ah, but, Inspector, it is not in contradiction that truth is lost. It is in contradiction that truth is revealed. Each of them has told us a fragment, and in their eagerness or reluctance they have told us more than they intended. Cray snorted, though less dismissively than before. Well then, what do you make of it? She folded her hands. Sir Clithering's gaze toward the desk, remarked upon by more than one, suggests something there troubled him. A photograph, perhaps, or some keepsake now missing. Mrs. Fenwick hesitated at that point, which may mean she knows more than she dares to say. Captain Arkwright insists nothing was amiss, yet his watchfulness betrays concern. He fears what might be uncovered. And Miss Price. She is young, but she carries a weight of knowledge. Her sorrow seemed genuine, yet her restraint tells me she guards a secret. The inspector frowned. And the butler? Poor Mr. Hadwell is fearful of suspicion, but his manner speaks of ignorance rather than guilt. The maid, however? Miss Marple's eyes twinkled faintly. She glanced at the desk too, as though afraid we might notice something she has seen. The contradictions gathered themselves into a pattern, a missing object, a card of love or betrayal, guests whose accounts diverged in telling ways, and beneath it all the silence of Sir Clithering himself, who had raised a toast to paradoxes before vanishing into death. As the questioning drew to its close, Miss Marple felt the veil thinning, though not yet lifting. Someone in that circle of witnesses had not only seen more than they admitted, but had acted to shape the scene, to remove what was dangerous, to leave what was misleading. It was not the absence of clues that puzzled her now, but the surfeit of them, scattered like crumbs by a hand that wished them to lead astray. She rose slowly from her chair, offering a mild smile. Inspector, You have heard many voices this day, but I dare say the truest words lie not in what was spoken, but in the silences between them. And as dusk settled once more over the moors, Miss Marple knew that the voices of deception had begun to betray their owners, though which voice concealed the murderer remained, for now, the greatest paradox of all. The lamps were lit in the great house, their glow casting long shadows across the drawing-room, where Sir Clithering's body had once lain. By now it had been taken away, leaving only the hollow shape of his presence in the minds of those gathered. Inspector Cray, his temper worn thin from the contradictions of the day, had ordered a temporary halt to questioning, but Miss Marple sat serenely in her chair, her hands folded over her knitting bag. To her mind the moment was ripe not for rest, but for quiet sorting, the weaving together of what had been said and what had been left unsaid. For in every crime, she knew, motives lay thick upon the ground like fallen leaves, and it was the detective's work to see which had been dropped naturally, and which had been torn away with intent. One by one she turned the faces of the suspects in her thoughts, and with each face came a different shade of desire, resentment, or fear, none innocent of motive, though perhaps not all guilty of deed. There was Mr. Fenwick, stout and prosperous, whose investments had long been entangled with Sir Clithering's ruthless dealings. She recalled whispers overheard during tea earlier in the week, that Fenwick had lost a small fortune through a failed scheme, one said to bear Sir Clithering's hidden hand. A man ruined financially might hold bitterness enough for murder, and Fenwick's forced geniality carried the air of one eager to conceal deeper rancour. Greed and revenge twined as one. Mrs. Fenwick was another matter. Her nervousness when speaking of the desk had not been lost on Miss Marple. What could trouble her so? A secret attachment, perhaps. The Queen of Hearts, lying so deliberately at the scene, might point toward jealousy, a wound in the realm of affection. Women sometimes bore knowledge their husbands never suspected, and sometimes bore the burdens of choices made in silence. Could it be that Mrs. Fenwick knew of Sir Clithering's interest in another, or feared a revelation that would disgrace her? Then there was Mrs. Lytton, sharp-eyed and eager to see enemies everywhere. Too eager, Miss Marple thought. Her words had pointed directly toward Fenwick, her insinuations dropped like crumbs in a trail. Was it a genuine suspicion, or an effort to turn eyes away from herself? Sir Clithering's rise in business had toppled more than one family, and there had been talk of Lytton money lost in some clever manoeuvre of his years ago. Old wounds of pride cut deepest. Captain Arkwright's presence puzzled her in another way. He had been steady, almost too steady, in his denials. His military bearing suggested a man used to command, to obedience, and yet his eyes had betrayed unease. Sir Clithering had been a financier, not a soldier, yet money moved in many circles. Had Arkwright debts? Did he resent dependence on Clithering's patronage, or fear the exposure of something best left buried? Men of honour could sometimes be driven to desperate measures when cornered, and young Miss Helena Price, his goddaughter, with eyes clouded by grief and restraint. Hers was the gentlest figure in the puzzle, but no less significant. Inheritance lay before her, if Sir Clithering's will named her. But more than money, Miss Marple sensed conflict of the heart. The card, the Queen of Hearts, it might signify not love given, but love denied. Had Helena found herself trapped in a web of Sir Clithering's stern expectations, perhaps bound by his plans for her future? Affection curdled by control could become motive enough. And then the servants. Poor Hadwell, the butler, his face pale with fear of suspicion. His loyalty seemed genuine, yet one could not discount resentment long stifled. Years of servitude under a hard master bred a bitterness that rarely found voice. The maid, though, had betrayed herself in a glance, a knowledge she had tried to conceal. Perhaps she had seen something, or been made to do something, that bound her in silence. Inspector Cray, pacing before the hearth, muttered aloud, "It's a blasted maze. Every one of them could have done it, and yet none could have. The locked room alone, how do you make sense of it?" Miss Marple's eyes followed the firelight as she spoke gently. "Mazes are not solved by force, Inspector. One must begin not with every path, but with the right turning. It is not which motive is true, but which motive is strongest. For motives, like weeds, grow thick together, and the one that thrives is the one given soil and sunlight. Cray frowned, but fell silent, listening despite himself. Miss Marple considered the missing photograph, the desk where Sir Clithering's eyes had lingered. It was not business, she felt certain. Those papers remained untouched. No, it was personal. The Queen of Hearts was too pointed, too intimate a gesture. It whispered of jealousy, of betrayal, of something closer to the heart than finance or property. That missing photograph, perhaps of a woman, was the heart of the matter. And yet, if that were so, why had every guest been so careful to say so little? Mrs. Fenwick's fluster, Helena's silence, the maid's glance. They all seemed to orbit the desk, as though drawn by an unseen gravity. Could it be that Sir Clithering's death was less a puzzle of money than of hidden affections? If so, the motives shifted. Jealousy from a wife, fear from a goddaughter, revenge from a woman wronged. But then again, there was the locked room. Miss Marple returned to it in thought, again and again. The dampness on the rug, the streak on the windowsill, the water carried in from the storm. Someone had been there after the guests left. Someone who should not have been. If the card was a message, it was not for them, but for the victim. Perhaps Sir Clithering had let in his own killer, confident enough to bolt the door behind him. That would mean trust. Fatal trust. The detective's mind turned slowly, sorting the strands of greed, jealousy, pride, and fear. Sir Clithering had held power over each of them in different ways. Their fortunes, their hearts, their reputations. Each had something to gain by his death. Yet one fact bound them all. Each account faltered when the desk was mentioned. Each story bent slightly when affection or betrayal was hinted at. Miss Marple leaned back, her voice low, almost to herself. "The maze is not without an exit, Inspector, but we must see the shape of it from above, not within. It is not only who desired Sir Clithering's death, but who dared to shape it as a paradox." Her words lingered as silence fell across the room. Outside, the moor wind pressed against the windows with a low, steady moan. Within, the suspects carried their motives like cloaks drawn tight about their shoulders. None without reason, none without cause. Yet the truth, Miss Marple felt certain, lay not in the abundance of motives, but in their tangle. One thread, pulled free, would unravel the rest. And as she closed her eyes for a moment, allowing the fragments to settle in her mind, she saw already the faint outline of that thread. Not enough to name the hand that had struck, but enough to know that the motive was not greed alone, nor revenge alone, nor even love betrayed, but a weave of them all, knotted into something darker. It was indeed a deadly paradox. Inspector Cray had been pacing the drawing-room like a caged hound when the constable entered with a scrap of triumph lighting his face. "Beg pardon, sir," he said breathlessly, "but we've found it, hidden under the stair carpet. A deck of playing cards, and the Queen of Hearts is missing." The news fell into the room like a thunderclap. For days the card had been the single riddle dangling above them, and now, at last, its origin seemed uncovered. Inspector Cray seized the worn packet of cards, fanned them briskly, and slapped them shut with the air of a man who smelled resolution. "There you are, Miss Marple. Not some fanciful token after all, but part of a set, concealed. The very queen that lay by the body must have come from here, and I dare say the one who hid the deck is the very one who dealt death." The household was assembled in haste, summoned once more into the oppressive chamber. Mr. Fenwick, flushed and sweating, muttered darkly about indignities. Mrs. Lytton stood with her chin high, her eyes glittering, as though the whole proceeding confirmed her suspicions. The maid paled, wringing her apron, and Helena Price hovered in the shadows, silent, pale as wax. Cray held the deck aloft like a weapon. This was hidden by someone in this house, and the motive is plain. Sir Clithering was slain and the card left as a signature. A game, perhaps, or a message. And the person who would know best of cards, who else but Captain Arkwright? He swung round on the soldier, who stiffened in indignation. "You were seen in the card-room earlier that night. You play often at your club. A man of your bearing doesn't mislay a deck under the stairs." Arkwright's voice was hard, clipped. "This is absurd. Yes, I play cards, as does half of London society. But I never carried a deck into Sir Clithering's house. Why should I? Why indeed, Cray snapped, unless it was part of your scheme. Murmurs rippled through the room. Mrs. Lytton leaned forward eagerly. I said so from the first, she crowed. The captain hides behind his uniform, but he is reckless, he is desperate. Everyone knows his debts. Arkwright flushed a dangerous shade, his fists tightening, but he did not speak. Miss Marple, who had been watching the proceedings with her usual mild patience, quietly observed, "It is interesting, Inspector, that the deck was found hidden rather than simply left in the open. One might wonder why, if it was used in a crime, it was not destroyed entirely." Cray waved a dismissive hand. "Hidden in haste, no doubt. A clumsy mistake, but one that will serve." He turned back to the assembly. "Captain Arkwright, you will accompany us to the station." The captain gave a short, bitter laugh. "So this is how it ends? On the say-so of a card and the spite of a woman." He cast a look toward Mrs. Lytton, whose eyes glittered with vindication. But Miss Marple's gaze lingered elsewhere, on Helena Price, who had flinched at the moment the deck was revealed, and whose lips now pressed together as though to hold back words, and on Mrs. Fenwick, who kept her eyes fixed determinedly on the floor. The truth of a room often lay not in those who shouted, but in those who kept still. That evening, as the captain was taken away, Inspector Cray declared the case well on its way to being solved. "It all fits," he said stoutly. "Motive, debt, opportunity. The storm gave him cover. Evidence, the missing card, the hidden deck. A neat business." Miss Marple's smile was faint, but her eyes were sharp as ever. "Neat, Inspector, I wonder. It has the look of neatness, certainly, but neatness can be contrived." He frowned. "You think the evidence planted?" She did not answer directly. Instead, she returned to the desk where the faint square mark still betrayed the absence of a photograph. "It is curious, is it not," she said gently, "that Sir Clithering should look often at his desk that night, and that the one thing missing from it should be of no interest to anyone but me? Yet everyone glances here, unwillingly or otherwise. I think the heart of this matter lies not in a game of cards, but in whatever image or keepsake was taken from this place." Cray grunted, unconvinced. "We've the card, the deck, and a man with debts. That will hold in court, Miss Marple." "Perhaps," she said softly, "but I've lived long enough to know that truth is not always the first thing to present itself. It prefers the shadows, waiting for the careless hand that draws it out." That night the house settled into uneasy silence. The suspects retired to their rooms, their whispers trailing off in the corridors. The storm had passed, leaving the moors under a brittle moonlight, but within the walls the air was no less stormy. Miss Marple sat quietly by the window of her guest chamber, her knitting idle in her lap. Her mind returned again to the card, the deck, the missing photograph. If the captain were guilty, why the elaborate symbol of the Queen of Hearts? Why remove a photograph? Why risk opening a window in a locked room? The threads did not tie neatly. They frayed, pulling her thoughts in different directions. Below, in the servants' quarters, the maid wept quietly, fearing her place. In another room, Mrs. Fenwick whispered fiercely to her husband, who urged her to silence, and Helena Price lay wakeful, her eyes fixed on the ceiling, the weight of her secret pressing too heavily for sleep. The next morning brought headlines already singing of Captain Arkwright's arrest. The inspector was congratulated for swift action, and he bore it with gruff pride. Yet Miss Marple's expression remained thoughtful, almost troubled, for she had seen too many cases where the easy answer, wrapped in a bow of evidence, concealed the true hand behind the curtain. She watched the suspects over breakfast. Mrs. Lytton was too satisfied, her smile sharp with victory. Mr. Fenwick ate heavily, but his wife barely touched her plate, her eyes darting nervously whenever the inspector spoke. Helena avoided the table altogether, pleading illness. Miss Marple stirred her tea, her voice quiet. "Inspector, I cannot help but feel we are being hurried along a path chosen for us. The deck was hidden, yes, but hidden where it must be found. If one wished to incriminate the captain, what better way than to use his known habits as a soldier and card player?" Cray frowned again. "You mean he's being framed?" "I mean," she said gently, "that the real criminal is clever enough to create a paradox, Evidence that points clearly, yet points too clearly. A little too convenient, don't you think? And as she spoke, a chill moved through her, for she knew in her bones that the killer had not yet finished. They had gained a false victory, yes, but the real game, the true revelation, lay still ahead, waiting for its moment to strike. Miss Marple had spent the morning walking quietly along the edges of the moor, letting the chill wind clear her thoughts. The false victory claimed by the authorities left her uneasy, as if the pieces of the puzzle had been set deliberately to mislead. Back at the house, the suspects moved about with the careful posture of those who feel watched, though in truth they were only watched by her unassuming gaze. It was in the ordinary, overlooked moments that truth often revealed itself. A glance held too long, a hand lingering near an object, a hesitation in speech. She returned to the drawing-room, now stripped of the body and the initial chaos of discovery, and her eyes fell again upon the desk where the faint outline of a missing photograph lingered. She leaned over it, considering, when her gaze shifted to a small stack of correspondence neatly tied with ribbon. Business letters, she thought at first, but then a single envelope, yellowed and sealed with wax, caught her attention. It was old, decades old perhaps, and bore the faintest trace of a crest she recognized. She opened it carefully, reading the cramped, spidery handwriting. It was a letter addressed to Sir Clithering, written many years ago. It spoke of debts unpaid, of promises broken, and of grievances carried in silence. But what drew Miss Marple's attention was a name mentioned almost casually, Mrs. Lytton. The letter accused her of deception in financial dealings, of misleading a business partner, and profiting while leaving others to ruin. The tone was polite but deadly precise, suggesting not mere accusation but knowledge of wrongdoing. Her mind whirled. Mrs. Lytton's keen eagerness during questioning suddenly gained a new weight. Her insinuations, against Captain Arkwright, her sharp eye for others' faults. It could be that she feared exposure herself. And yet the letter was decades old. Surely she could not be threatened by it now, unless it had been kept as leverage, or perhaps forgotten, until some recent event rekindled old resentment. She turned the letter over in her hands, scanning again. Another name appeared, Mr. Fenwick. It seemed that in the past Fenwick had been involved in the same tangled web of financial dealings. So too had Mrs. Fenwick, though indirectly, a quiet presence in the background, handling correspondence and accounts while the men conducted their business. A connection, long hidden, linked the Fenwicks and the Lyttons through shared dealings that had ended badly for some, profitably for others. It was subtle, easily forgotten, and yet it now formed a lattice across which motives could travel, binding these families to Sir Clithering's fortunes in ways no modern observation had caught. Miss Marple's mind traced the lines carefully. Here, she realized, was a past reaching into the present. Resentment seeded decades ago could have grown quietly, nurtured by the small wounds of pride, missed opportunities, and hidden jealousies. Sir Clithering, it seemed, had held more than just money over these people. He held memories, proof of past misdeeds, the faintest threat capable of shaping actions in the present. She also considered Helena Price, Sir Clithering's goddaughter, whose presence had seemed almost incidental until now. She was young, untainted by the original disputes, yet her inheritance and proximity to the estate made her a living link to both families. Perhaps she too had been brought unwittingly into old rivalries, her allegiance or silence a prize in a game that had begun long before her birth. The past, Miss Marple mused, was a shadow that could linger, stretching far beyond those who thought it buried. And in this house, every shadow had a voice, and every voice had a motive. She thought of the Queen of Hearts, of the missing photograph, of the deck hidden beneath the stair carpet. All were present, yet all seemed symbolic, a language only those familiar with the long history of grudges and secrets could read. Later that day, she requested to speak privately with the maid. The girl arrived trembling, unused to attention, but Miss Marple's calm, gentle manner encouraged her to speak. "You said nothing yesterday," Miss Marple began, "but your eyes betrayed you when the photograph and the desk were mentioned. Tell me, have you seen this letter or anything like it before?" The maid hesitated, then nodded. "Yes, miss. I saw a letter like that once long ago. Sir Clithering kept it tucked away, and I was told never to touch it." Her voice dropped. "It concerned the families, the Littons and the Fenwicks. I did not understand it then." "And now?" Miss Marple asked. "Now," the girl whispered, "I understand. That letter could make people very angry. They have old grudges, things buried deep. I think that's why Sir Clithering was afraid last night. Or maybe it was not fear. Maybe he expected someone to act." Miss Marple nodded slowly, piecing the threads together. The hidden connection, overlooked by all but the keenest eye, linked the suspects not only to one another but to a history of slights, losses, and triumphs. The motive for murder, she realized, was no longer a single thread. It was a network, a web of old grievances and unresolved conflicts stretching through decades. Greed and jealousy were joined now by memory and fear, each influencing the other in subtle but powerful ways. She thought of Mrs. Lytton, her eagerness and sharp eyes, and of the Fenwicks, each defensive in their way, and Helena, whose youth and position made her a silent focal point of all these entangled histories. The crime, Miss Marple understood, was not just a matter of present resentment, but of past wrongs reaching forward to claim consequence. Her mind lingered over the small details the authorities had overlooked: the damp streak by the window, the faint outline of the missing photograph, the hidden deck of cards. Each had its place in the puzzle, but each also connected to something far older. The Queen of Hearts, she mused, might symbolize not merely love, but betrayal carried across time, a warning, a message, or perhaps a mockery of those who thought only in the present. By evening, she had requested to see the correspondence between the families, the documents Sir Clithering had kept in his study. With the letters spread before her, the tangled history became clearer: old debts, favours withdrawn, promises ignored, reputations damaged. And throughout it all, Sir Clithering had stood, observing, recording, knowing that those who had wronged him, or been wronged, could be called upon at any time, and that the consequences of the past could reach into the present with deadly precision. Miss Marple leaned back, her eyes tracing the web she had uncovered. The crime was not a simple act of passion or greed. It was a culmination, a striking out of long-buried resentments, a carefully orchestrated drama drawing on decades of human emotion and frailty. The killer, she knew, had studied the past as meticulously as they had prepared the present, leaving clues designed to mislead, symbols meant to confuse, yet unable to erase the trace of history connecting them all. As the house settled into the hush of night, Miss Marple closed the letters gently, her mind alive with the implications. Shadows of the past, she realized, were rarely extinguished. They lingered, shaping choices, guiding hands, and in the case of Sir Clithering's death, they had reached forward to claim life itself. And in that quiet moment, she knew the truth was beginning to emerge, not from a single action, but from the weight of years, the memory of wrongs, and the hidden connections that bound the living to the dead in ways no casual observation could ever reveal. Miss Marple had spent the better part of the morning reviewing the tangled threads of the case in her mind, seated quietly in the study while the household bustled around her. The false arrest of Captain Arkwright had stirred unease, and the shadows of old grudges only thickened the fog of suspicion. She knew the standard methods: questioning, observation, physical evidence, had brought them only so far. What was needed now was something subtler, a way to see not what the suspects said, but what their reactions betrayed. She summoned the household to the drawing-room under the pretense of reviewing the crime scene and observing behaviour in the presence of certain objects. The suspects entered, each wary, each sensing the investigator's attention like a breeze across a pond, stirring currents unseen. Miss Marple's eyes moved quietly over them, noting posture, expression, and the nervous tick of a hand brushing against a seam or collar. "I have asked you here," she began in her gentle, deliberate voice, "to discuss Sir Clithering's library. He took great care in arranging it, as with all things in his life. Some books he valued not for their content, but for what they concealed or represented. In fact, he often left messages or reminders tucked within their pages." The mention of messages produced a ripple among the guests. Some, like Mrs. Lytton, stiffened, her expression momentarily betraying something deeper than curiosity. Helena Price glanced toward the shelves, hesitation flickering across her pale face. Even Mrs. Fenwick's fingers tightened upon the edge of her chair. Miss Marple's smile remained small, imperceptible, but her mind worked swiftly. "I should like each of you," she continued, "to select a book at random and open it to a page. Consider it as if Sir Clithering himself had left a note for you within. Tell me what it might say, what message it would carry for you." The request was unusual, and the room shifted with a blend of amusement and unease. Inspector Cray gave a doubtful grunt. "Miss Marple, with respect, this seems hardly a proper method for investigation." "Oh, I assure you, Inspector, it is most proper," she replied, her tone mild, almost indulgent. "We are not seeking facts merely. We are seeking reactions. The mind reveals itself in what it projects onto objects, especially when those objects hold hidden significance." One by one, the guests complied. Mr. Fenwick chose a leather-bound ledger, flipping hastily through it. "I suppose it would say, 'Keep careful account, and beware those who would take advantage,'" he offered, his voice steady but his hands betraying slight trembling. Mrs. Lytton selected a tome of local history. "Perhaps, 'Do not forget past injustices,'" she said primly, yet her eyes darted nervously toward Miss Marple. The tone of her voice suggested that the past was not merely academic, but personal, and that the book's imagined message resonated in a way she did not intend to reveal. The maid was next. She took a modest volume of poetry, her hands shaking. She opened it carefully, looked at the page, and whispered, "It would say that secrets once known cannot be unseen." Her eyes met Miss Marple's, wide and startled, and for a moment the air between them was taut. Then it was Helena Price's turn. She approached the shelves slowly, deliberately, and picked a small, unassuming book. She opened it, her fingers lingering at the binding, and read aloud softly. It would say, "Beware of what you cannot change, for the past always follows." Her eyes flicked at Mrs. Lytton, who stiffened, and then at Fenwick, whose jaw had tightened. Miss Marple noted these subtle exchanges carefully. Finally, she asked Mrs. Fenwick to participate. The woman hesitated, then selected a large volume of etiquette, its gilded letters catching the afternoon sun. She opened it at random, then faltered, her fingers brushing nervously across the page. It would say that propriety must be maintained, that appearances are everything," she said, her voice sharp, though the tremor beneath it betrayed anxiety. She looked past Miss Marple toward the door as though seeking escape from the test. Miss Marple smiled softly, setting aside her knitting. "Thank you all. You have been most helpful." But inside, she had observed more than words conveyed. Helena's selection, her careful phrasing, revealed a consciousness aware of others' knowledge, a subtle acknowledgement of connection, guilt, or fear. Mrs. Lytton's rigidity betrayed personal resonance with past injustices, and Mrs. Fenwick, in attempting to maintain composure, revealed the deepest agitation, as though the book had struck at some hidden nerve. Turning to the maid once more, Miss Marple asked quietly, "You mentioned secrets. Did you ever see something in Sir Clithering's study that troubled you, or that you were told to hide?" The girl's eyes filled with tears. I saw letters, miss. Letters about the Lyttons and the Fenwicks. And photographs. Some were removed, some hidden. I thought it was not for me to know." Miss Marple nodded gently, as though confirming a quiet truth. Indeed, sometimes those entrusted with secrets bear them heavily, though unwittingly, and yet the person who understands the significance of what is hidden has the power to act decisively. A tension settled in the room. Miss Marple's unusual tactic had done what observation and questioning alone could not. It had allowed her to see cracks in the calm, the gestures and hesitations that betrayed unease. The suspects had been confronted not with accusations, but with themselves, their own reactions projected onto objects they perceived to be charged with meaning. Inspector Cray, watching with growing impatience, frowned. "I do not understand, Miss Marple. What has this proven?" "It has proven," she said, her voice steady and soft, "that the threads of fear and guilt are present, that reactions, when prompted subtly, reveal more than words ever will. Some of these people hold truths they have sought to bury, and their careful facades are now showing fine cracks." She looked around the room, noting the shift in posture, the avoidance of eye contact, the quickness to glance at one another. "And in those cracks," she continued, "lie the hints we need. A deception is rarely perfect, Inspector. Even the cleverest can betray themselves in the smallest, most unexpected ways." Miss Marple returned to the desk, her fingers brushing the faint square where the photograph had been. The psychological test had revealed nothing concrete yet, no confession, no direct accusation, but it had illuminated the landscape of fear, desire, and concealment. Helena Price's cautious words, Mrs. Fenwick's nervous attempt at propriety, the maid's reluctant acknowledgement, all converged into a map of subtle truths, a guide to the next steps. She considered the Queen of Hearts, still vivid in her mind as a symbol, and the hidden deck beneath the stairs. Each piece of the puzzle now seemed less a riddle in isolation, and more a reflection of human behaviour under pressure. The real criminal, she realised, was watching carefully as well, measuring reactions, calculating risk, and in doing so, the perpetrator had left a trace, a crack in their own performance, revealed by Miss Marple's unconventional tactic. As the day drew to a close, she sat quietly, allowing the household to depart one by one. Her eyes lingered on the photograph's empty space, on the desk, on the bookshelves that had yielded so much through a simple exercise of projection. The clues had multiplied, but so had the clarity of the suspect's reactions. The unseen hand behind the crime had exposed itself, not in deeds alone, but in the tremor, the glance, the hesitation, subtle but unmistakable. Miss Marple's lips curved in a faint smile. Sometimes, she reflected, the most revealing evidence is not found in what is present, but in how people respond to the things they fear. The detective's work, after all, was not simply to follow facts, but to follow the truth wherever it might tremble beneath the surface. Miss Marple had just begun to piece together the subtle truths revealed by her psychological test, when a fresh disturbance shook the household. The afternoon sun streamed through the drawing-room windows, illuminating the dust motes that danced in the still air, but the calm was deceptive. A hurried knock at the study door brought her attention, and she rose slowly, knitting needles still in hand, to find one of the constables looking as pale as a sheet. "Miss Marple," he said, voice quivering, There's been a problem in the study. Something's missing. The photograph, the one we thought gone, has been taken or removed again." Her heart quickened. She had suspected that the missing photograph was the key to understanding Sir Clithering's death, but to have it vanish now was a blow not merely to evidence but to the very momentum of the investigation. "Taken, you say?" she murmured, moving toward the door. "Yes, miss. We arrived to check the desk, and it was gone. There's no sign of forced entry, but someone must have been in there after we left." Miss Marple's mind raced. Whoever had taken the photograph, or replaced it, or destroyed it, knew precisely its significance. It was no longer simply a matter of discovering a motive or tracking a suspect. Someone was actively working to bury the truth. Inspector Cray arrived soon after, his brow furrowed and his temper fraying further. "Miss Marple, this is intolerable," he exclaimed, lifting the edge of the desk. Everything was going so smoothly, and now this. What good is a photograph if it vanishes before we can examine it? This is sabotage, deliberate obstruction. Miss Marple's voice was calm, though her eyes glimmered with the sharp light of understanding. "Indeed, Inspector, and we must consider not only who had motive to remove it, but opportunity and knowledge. The theft, or disappearance, tells us as much as the object itself. Someone wishes to protect themselves, or someone else, and that someone is clever, for they have acted while attention was elsewhere." Cray ran a hand over his face. "But who? Everyone is under our scrutiny. All doors were locked after the last questioning." "Locked," Miss Marple said softly, "but not impervious to observation. One might move without leaving signs of entry if timing and knowledge are combined carefully. and it would require someone aware that the photograph's existence mattered, someone attuned to Sir Clithering's habits and secrets. Her thoughts turned immediately to the suspects: Mrs. Lytton, eager and questioning, keenly aware of the past; the Fenwicks, defensive and nervous; Helena, restrained yet watchful; and even the servants who moved through the house quietly, their knowledge underestimated by those above stairs. One of them had recognized the photograph's importance and had acted decisively, perhaps impulsively, perhaps with careful calculation. She walked to the desk herself, noting once more the faint outline of where the photograph had rested. The air around it seemed heavier, charged with absence. She ran a finger lightly along the edge, noting the small indentation in the varnish. Someone had handled it carefully, with gloves perhaps, leaving little trace. Whoever did this had the skill or the presence of mind to avoid obvious clues. Miss Marple turned to the household. "We must assume," she said calmly, "that whoever removed the photograph is now among us. They will be cautious, watching, waiting, and they may act again if given reason." The effect was immediate. Mrs. Lytton stiffened, her hands folded rigidly before her. Mrs. Fenwick's face paled slightly, and Helena shifted in her seat, a small, nervous movement of the shoulders that betrayed tension. Even the maid wrung her hands as if unable to remain composed under the weight of invisible scrutiny. Inspector Cray barked orders for a search of the entire house. Drawers were opened, wardrobes sifted through, every hiding place examined with meticulous care. Yet, as evening descended and shadows stretched across the study, there was no sign of the photograph. It was as though it had vanished into thin air. Miss Marple, however, remained calm. "Not vanished, Inspector," she said softly. "Moved, yes, but not lost. And the manner in which it has been removed tells us as much about the perpetrator as the photograph might have told about Sir Clithering." She sat quietly by the window, gazing out at the moor and the lengthening shadows. Her mind traced the lines of motive and opportunity again, considering reactions, gestures, and subtle tells. Whoever had taken the photograph had acted not in a panic, but with purpose. They knew exactly what they feared, and how to control the investigation by removing the evidence. Later, she requested the presence of Mrs. Fenwick, asking her casually to recount the movements of the household during the day. The woman's voice was low, hesitant. I was in the garden most of the afternoon, Miss Marple. Mr. Fenwick walked the halls, ensuring no one disturbed the servants. I did not see anyone near the desk. Perhaps the maid?" Miss Marple's eyes met hers. "You mention the maid, and yet, when asked before, your story was different. You seemed uncertain, almost reluctant to suggest her presence. Why do you hesitate?" Mrs. Fenwick's hands trembled. I do not know, truly. I did not see her touch anything, but I feared someone might." Miss Marple nodded slowly. Fear and deception were rarely separate in such moments. "Thank you, Mrs. Fenwick. That will be all for now." The inspector, observing the exchange, muttered, "More delay, more misdirection. I do not understand, Miss Marple. What are we supposed to do next?" Miss Marple's voice was soft, precise. "Observe, Inspector. Watch carefully those who might have had the opportunity to act, and consider what they stand to lose if the photograph, or what it represents, were discovered. The theft itself is a clue, not merely an obstruction. The hand that moved it has revealed intentions and priorities more clearly than any confession." As the household retired for the night, attention lingered thickly in the hallways. Trust, once fragile, now hung by a thread, for each person suspected the other of cunning and concealment. Miss Marple, however, felt a renewed clarity. In the vanished photograph she saw not only a missing object, but a marker of the criminal's confidence and fear, the very duality that would allow her to anticipate the next move. The night deepened, the moon rising over the moor, and within the house she considered carefully the reactions and movements she had observed. Whoever had taken the photograph remained among them, hiding behind a mask of composure, but leaving behind subtle evidence in gesture, hesitation, and glance. The real criminal had not yet revealed themselves fully, but the act of vanishing evidence had done more than conceal. It had illuminated. Miss Marple closed her eyes briefly, envisioning the paths, the connections, the web of old grudges and present fear. The photograph may have been taken, but in its absence the truth had begun to emerge more sharply. And as she sat in the dimly lit study, she knew that the stakes had risen, the shadows deepened, and the real game was only just beginning. The morning had begun with a deceptive calm, the household slowly stirring as sunlight filtered through the tall windows. Miss Marple sat in the drawing-room, quietly sipping tea, while the household buzzed with the tension of the vanished photograph. Inspector Cray had taken to pacing the hallways, muttering about inefficiency and obstruction, convinced that every delay was a threat to justice. It was shortly after mid-morning that a sharp scream rent the air, slicing through the fragile piece like a knife. Miss Marple's teacup trembled in her hands, and she rose at once, moving with surprising swiftness toward the source. The hallways were already chaotic. Servants scuttled like startled mice, and the inspector barreled ahead with heavy boots. The scream had come from the east wing, a rarely used corridor that led to the old library and several guest rooms. There, at the foot of the grand staircase, lay the body of Mrs. Lytton, her face pale and eyes wide in shock. A small ornate letter opener protruded from her chest, the gold handle catching the light. Miss Marple paused, taking in the scene, her keen mind rapidly absorbing the details. "Another!" Cray exclaimed aghast. "Another murder in the house! It cannot be! I thought we had the captain under arrest." "Think carefully, Inspector," Miss Marple said quietly, kneeling beside the body. "The captain is elsewhere, and yet the crime continues. This is no act of impulse. It is calculated, deliberate. Whoever strikes again is not only capable, but confident enough to defy our efforts." She examined the letter opener closely. It was clean, polished, and free from fingerprints. A deliberate choice, intended to leave no trace. A small smudge of blood on the polished banister suggested that the murderer had moved with care, dragging or lifting the body in a manner that left only subtle traces. The placement of the body at the base of the staircase rather than in the room itself was deliberate, a signal perhaps intended to communicate fear or misdirection. The household had gathered in the hall, faces pale and stricken. Mrs. Fenwick clutched her husband's arm, whispering nervously. Helena Price hovered at the rear, eyes wide and fixed on Miss Marple. The maid trembled, hands pressed to her apron as if bracing herself against the unseen threat. Each was a potential suspect, yet each also bore the weight of fear, uncertain whether the next strike would fall on them. Miss Marple stood, her mind turning like a well-oiled clock. "Notice, Inspector," she said, gesturing toward the body, "the manner in which the crime has been committed. It is different from Sir Clithering's murder. The choice of weapon is personal, yet the precision is deliberate. The placement is symbolic. This is the work of someone who wishes to confuse us, to escalate fear, to manipulate perception." Cray rubbed his face, muttering, "But why? Why create a second murder? What purpose could it serve if the first is supposedly solved?" "Because," Miss Marple replied softly, "the first crime did not solve anything at all. It merely created a facade, a false conclusion. The real criminal remains at large, orchestrating events from the shadows, testing reactions, and diverting attention from themselves. Each act now is a message, calculated to keep the investigation off balance." Her eyes moved deliberately across the assembled household. Helena's pale expression, Mrs. Fenwick's taut anxiety, and even the maid's trembling all indicated the same thing, knowledge or awareness of the past deeds or the hidden photograph. And then there was the quiet presence of Captain Arkwright, detained but still a figure in their minds, looming in absentia as a red herring designed to mislead the authorities. Miss Marple turned her gaze to the stairs and the body. "Note the trajectory," she murmured. "The letter opener is thrust not in haste, but with a measure of ceremony, as if the act were meant to be observed in a particular way. Someone has a message to deliver, and we must decipher it before more are harmed." The inspector was growing impatient, pacing in tight circles. "Miss Marple, we must secure the house, question everyone again. There can be no more mistakes. How do you suggest we proceed?" She considered briefly. "We observe, we watch, but we do so knowing that the perpetrator is watching us in return. This is a game of anticipation, a contest of patience. Each person in this household is now a potential witness, an ally, or a suspect, and the villain, confident in their advantage, will act again if we do not anticipate their needs, their fears, their knowledge. The household had been ordered to remain in their quarters while a detailed search commenced, but Miss Marple knew the true search was mental. The mind of the criminal, she realized, was always several steps ahead. She considered the vanished photograph, the hidden deck of cards, the letters tying the families together through decades of resentment. All of these were pieces of a puzzle that the villain could manipulate at will. Later, she requested a private audience with Helena Price. The young woman had remained calm, but her eyes betrayed fear. "Miss Marple," Helena whispered, "do you think they will come for me next?" "The way Mrs. Lytton—" "I do not know who will be next," Miss Marple replied. "But I do know that whoever strikes is clever and deliberate. That is precisely why we must be cleverer, more deliberate still. Observation, patience, and understanding the connections that link this house together are our only defense. The second act tells us more than the first. The villain is bold, they are confident, and they are aware that we are looking in the wrong place." Helena shivered. "But how can anyone anticipate someone so cunning?" Miss Marple's gaze was steady, unflinching. "By remembering that the cleverest often reveal themselves in their confidence, by noting the smallest hesitations, the faintest glances, and the subtle gestures that betray unease. The real criminal believes themselves untouchable, yet every move leaves a trace, if one knows where to look." As evening fell, the house settled into uneasy silence. The second murder had shifted everything. The false victory of Captain Arkwright's arrest, the vanishing photograph, the network of old grudges, all now converged into a heightened sense of peril. Miss Marple's mind worked steadily, arranging facts, behaviours, and connections into a framework that could anticipate the next action. The villain, she realized, was no longer merely hiding. They were testing, daring, taunting, not merely to commit murder, but to assert control, to manipulate perception, and to remain several steps ahead. Miss Marple felt the weight of the challenge, but also the thrill. The game had sharpened, the stakes were higher, and the resolution now required not only deduction, but vigilance, anticipation, and the quiet patience of one who observes the smallest crack in the facade. And so, with the household on edge and the shadows of the past pressing close, Miss Marple prepared to confront a new phase of the mystery. The real criminal remained at large, bold and cunning, and the detective would need every ounce of her skill to prevent yet another tragedy from unfolding in the house where Sir Clithering had died. Miss Marple sat in the quiet of the drawing-room late that evening, the house steeped in a tension that had become almost physical. The second murder had left the household anxious, the air thick with fear and suspicion. Even the servants moved as though the slightest sound might summon the unknown hand still orchestrating events from the shadows. She sipped her tea slowly, letting her mind wander over the threads she had collected, the hidden photograph, the missing Queen of Hearts, the letters linking the Lyttons and the Fenwicks through decades of grudges, and the reactions elicited during her unconventional test with the books. Each piece had its own weight, but none alone explained the puzzle. And yet, as she considered them together, a tiny, nearly trivial detail returned to her mind. The small, silver thimble, polished but dented, that had been found on the floor of the East Wing the morning of Mrs. Lytton's murder. At the time, it had seemed inconsequential, perhaps a remnant of a sewing project. The inspector had dismissed it, the maid had stammered when questioned, and Miss Marple herself had made a mental note but set it aside in favour of larger clues. Now, however, she pondered it anew. The thimble was small, yes, but distinctive. One side bore a faint engraving, a swirl that suggested it had been part of a personal set, carried often by its owner. Miss Marple recalled the maid's trembling confession about seeing letters and photographs, and Helena Price's careful choice of words when describing warnings and the past. The thimble was the first tangible trace of a hand moving stealthily through the house, one that could not be erased easily, no matter how careful the perpetrator. Miss Marple walked slowly to the East Wing, her mind turning over behaviours, habits, and gestures. The thimble, paired with a letter opener, and the clean handling of the photograph suggested a person accustomed to precision, someone meticulous and careful in small, deliberate movements. It was not brute force or impetuousness that had shaped these acts, but control and calculation. She thought back to Mrs. Fenwick, whose nervous anxiety had been palpable when the photograph was discovered missing. Helena, whose words and glances had betrayed a fear that seemed almost too deep for her years, and Mrs. Lytton, whose eagerness to point fingers had been driven by something beyond simple malice. Then it came, the small comment she had almost dismissed during the initial questioning. Mrs. Fenwick, when asked about her afternoon movements, had said, "I was attending to matters of propriety as always. One cannot let minor distractions interfere with one's duties." At the time, Miss Marple had noted the phrasing, but thought it a polite affectation. Now she saw it for what it was, a declaration of habitual caution, of meticulous oversight, a person accustomed to control, someone who could remove a photograph and leave only the faintest traces. Miss Marple returned to the desk, imagining the sequence of events, the removal of the photograph, the concealment of the deck beneath the stairs, the second murder executed with precision. Each action had been deliberate, designed to manipulate perception, but all bore a subtle signature, the care and method of someone who was both familiar with the household and attentive to detail. And then she remembered another seemingly minor observation, the faint, almost imperceptible scent of lavender lingering near the east wing after Mrs. Lytton's body had been discovered. At first, she had assumed it was simply the maid's perfume or a cleaning agent, but, in conjunction with the thimble, the controlled placement of objects, and the careful handling of evidence, it formed a pattern. The presence of lavender indicated the same hand moving quietly, deliberately, leaving behind tiny traces that connected one act to the next. Miss Marple called the household together once more, this time not to accuse but to observe reactions. She placed the thimble on the table, alongside the letter opener, and a deck of cards laid casually but deliberately in front of them. She spoke gently, almost as if narrating a story rather than questioning suspects. "These objects," she said, "have all moved through the house in a careful sequence. Each has a place, each leaves a trace, each speaks, if one knows how to listen. And in that listening, patterns emerge." The guests shifted uneasily. Helena's eyes flicked to Mrs. Fenwick, and Mrs. Fenwick's hands tightened as she clasped them in her lap. Even the maid, standing quietly at the back, seemed to shrink into herself. Miss Marple's gaze lingered on the small silver thimble. The careful handling of each item, the placement, the avoidance of fingerprints, even the use of familiar scents. These are not accidents. They are the signature of someone who knows the house, who knows the habits of its occupants, and who wishes to control the narrative of this investigation. Her voice was calm, but the weight of her observation was unmistakable. The second murder was not random. The missing photograph was not lost. The Queen of Hearts was not misplaced. All were moved with care, with intention, and all point towards someone whose habits and behavior are consistent, someone who cannot resist leaving tiny, telling signs even in the midst of concealment. The room was silent, tension pressing like a tangible weight. Miss Marple allowed a moment to pass before continuing. Patterns, when carefully traced, reveal their source. They show us the hand behind the actions, even when the acts themselves are shrouded in deception. What seemed disconnected, trivial, or insignificant is now, in retrospect, a map. And if one follows that map, the truth, long obscured, can finally be reached. She paused, looking at the faces before her, noting each micro-expression, each subtle twitch of muscle or hesitation of breath. The villain had been clever, confident, and careful, but even the most careful leave traces. Tiny habits, small gestures, habitual scents, and offhand remarks. These were the keys that, when aligned, revealed the pattern. Miss Marple stood, holding the thimble lightly between her fingers. The pieces have been in plain sight all along. The hand that orchestrated these events has left a trail, subtle but undeniable, connecting each act to the next. And once one sees the pattern, one begins to understand not only who acted, but why, and how the next move might be anticipated and prevented. She allowed the weight of her words to settle, letting the household absorb the implication without fear, but with the knowledge that the calm of observation could reveal far more than hasty accusation ever could. The puzzle, she realized, had shifted. No longer was it merely about collecting clues, it was about interpreting them, following the faintest traces, and understanding the rhythm and habits of the mind behind the crimes. The pattern had emerged, and with it, a path forward, one that promised not only resolution but the opportunity to anticipate the villain's next action before tragedy struck again. Miss Marple sat back, fingers lightly brushing the thimble, her eyes reflecting the quiet triumph of insight. The pattern was now visible, a network of small but telling signs, and she knew with certainty that the key to the mystery had been under her very nose all along, waiting for patience and perception to reveal it. Miss Marple sat quietly in the drawing-room, letting the afternoon sun spill across the polished floorboards. The household was tense, the second murder still fresh, yet the bustle had resumed, though half-heartedly, as if the servants feared movement might summon further violence. Inspector Cray had returned to pacing the halls, muttering about procedures, evidence, and the lack thereof. Miss Marple, however, had set aside formalities, allowing her mind to wander across the landscape of the crime with the patience of one accustomed to reading between lines others overlooked. She sipped her tea slowly, eyes resting on the small silver thimble that had been found in the east wing shortly after Mrs. Lytton's death. At the time, it had seemed trivial, perhaps a remnant of a sewing project, but now it seemed almost luminous in its significance. The thimble was polished, but the dent on one side suggested repeated use, carried by someone meticulous, cautious, and used to working with delicate precision. That combination of traits, care, patience, subtlety, was consistent with someone capable of both removing the photograph and committing the second murder without leaving overt traces. Her gaze wandered to the desk where Sir Clithering had kept his letters and the place where the photograph had rested. The faint outline still remained, though the photograph itself had vanished. She recalled the Queen of Hearts tucked beneath the stair carpet, the letters connecting the Lyttons and the Fenwicks, and the subtle reactions she had elicited during her unconventional test with the books. Each incident had seemed isolated, insignificant in isolation, but she now began to see a web forming, a hidden pattern threaded through behaviour, objects, and minor details that no one else had considered important. And then she remembered it, an offhand comment Mrs. Fenwick had made during her questioning. "I was attending to matters of propriety, as always. One cannot let minor distractions interfere with one's duties," she had said, phrasing it almost casually. At the time, Miss Marple had noted the politeness of the statement, but had dismissed it as a habit of speech. Now, however, it struck her sharply. It revealed a person who measured every action, who valued control, order, and appearances above all else. That was a trait consistent with the careful handling of evidence, the removal of objects like the photograph, and the precise execution of the second murder. She rose and walked slowly through the drawing-room, considering each person's movements and habits. The maid, though trembling, had confessed to seeing letters and photographs, hinting at awareness of secrets beyond her station. Helena Price had been cautious in her words, careful to convey knowledge without overstepping, and Mrs. Lytton, whose eagerness and sharp observations had seemed driven by curiosity, now appeared to have been motivated by a deeper fear or awareness of past transgressions. Miss Marple's eyes returned to the silver thimble. Tiny, easily overlooked, yet a mark of presence. It indicated someone familiar with subtlety and careful movements, someone who could remove a photograph, leave behind objects like the Queen of Hearts or letters, and manipulate the atmosphere without drawing attention to themselves. And the faint scent of lavender she had noticed near the east wing after Mrs. Lytton's death, once dismissed as trivial, now seemed deliberate, a subtle signature, left perhaps unconsciously, but revealing nonetheless. She called the household together, not to accuse, but to observe. She placed the thimble, the letter opener, and the Queen of Hearts on the table before them, arranging them casually but deliberately. "These objects have all been moved, handled, or placed with care," she said softly, letting her voice carry over the room. "Each bears a trace of intention, a signature of the hand that guided it. The second murder, the vanished photograph, and even the seemingly trivial placement of items are not random. They form a pattern, a sequence that, if one observes carefully, points toward a single mind, orchestrating these events. Helena's eyes flicked nervously toward Mrs. Fenwick, whose hands clenched tightly in her lap. Even the maid, who stood quietly at the back, seemed to shrink into herself under the weight of the observation. Miss Marple allowed a moment of silence to settle, letting the tension in the room grow just enough to elicit subtle reactions. "Notice," she continued, "the thimble, small, seemingly insignificant, yet indicative of habitual care. The placement of the letter opener, precise and deliberate, the deck of cards hidden beneath the stairs. Even the faint scent of lavender in the east wing is part of this sequence. When one observes closely, these minor details reveal far more than any spoken confession ever could." She paused, watching the faces before her, noting each micro-expression: Helena's quick glance, Mrs. Fenwick's taut anxiety, the maid's subtle withdrawal. Each gesture, each hesitation, each flicker of recognition contributed to the emerging pattern. The criminal had been clever, confident, and methodical, but even the most meticulous leave traces, tiny habits, repeated gestures, and offhand remarks that, when pieced together, illuminate the hand behind the acts. Miss Marple leaned back in her chair, fingers lightly brushing the thimble. "The pattern has been present all along," she said softly, "hidden in behaviour, in small objects, in minor gestures. It has been waiting for observation, patience, and careful thought to reveal it. Those who orchestrated these events believed they could obscure the truth, but even in concealment, one's habits betray them. And it is in those betrayals, in these subtle consistencies, that we find the key to understanding the crimes and preventing further harm." Inspector Cray shifted impatiently, though he remained silent, sensing the quiet authority behind her words. Miss Marple allowed him a moment to absorb the implication before continuing. "Once the pattern is understood, it is possible to anticipate the next move, the sequence, the habits, the subtle signatures. They tell us not just who acted, but how they think and where they might strike next." Her eyes swept across the room, taking in Helena, Mrs. Fenwick, and the others. Each was linked by the web of behaviour, history, and subtle interactions that Sir Clithering's life and death had set in motion. And in that web, the signature of the criminal had been inscribed all along, quiet, deliberate, and waiting for the patient observer to recognise it. As evening fell, Miss Marple sat back, the quiet satisfaction of understanding settling over her. The chaos of 2 murders, vanished photographs, and hidden letters had yielded to a clarity that only patient observation could bring. The pattern had emerged. Small details, seemingly insignificant, had aligned to reveal the movements, habits, and mind of the person responsible. The case was no longer a formless tangle of suspicion and fear. It was a sequence, a chain of deliberate acts, each leaving its subtle mark. And now, seeing the connections clearly, Miss Marple knew the next steps, the avenues to anticipate, and the measures necessary to prevent further tragedy. The key had indeed been in plain sight all along. It had merely waited for the right observer to notice. Miss Marple had spent the morning quietly reviewing her notes and observations, tracing the patterns of behaviour, the subtle traces left in objects, the reactions, the hesitation, the almost imperceptible gestures that had revealed the presence of the criminal's hand. She sat by the window, looking out at the moor, the wind stirring the heather, and letting her thoughts align the scattered pieces of the mystery. The pattern had emerged, yes, but the motive, the engine driving these dark acts, still seemed shrouded. It was one thing to recognize the criminal's careful movements, and another to understand the compelling force that had driven them to murder. The breakthrough came unexpectedly, sparked by a chance remark from Helena Price as she passed by the study. "It's strange," she murmured, "how some people cling to the past, as if the present isn't enough." The words lingered in Miss Marple's mind, their casual tone belying an insight into the psychology of the household. Clinging to the past? Yes. That had been the theme woven subtly through the interactions she had observed. Letters hidden, old grudges, silent resentments carried forward. These were not mere eccentricities. They were the threads that bound the criminal to a past they could not or would not relinquish. She began by reviewing the connections she had already noted, the Littons and Fenwicks, families intertwined over decades, each slight remembered, each favour withheld or given with strings attached. Sir Clithering's death had been the spark, but the fire had been waiting, nurtured over years of small betrayals, perceived injustices, and careful observation of vulnerabilities. The criminal had watched the household for years, learning habits, observing reactions, noting small weaknesses. The careful placement of objects, the removal of the photograph, the execution of the second murder, all these acts now seemed less like attempts at concealment and more like statements, deliberate expressions of a psychological need. She thought of the silver thimble, dented yet polished, carried everywhere, a symbol of control and precision. The faint scent of lavender left behind after Mrs. Litton's death, almost subconscious in its placement. The subtle, careful handling of each item. None of this was mere habit. It was ritual, a performance that satisfied a psychological compulsion. And the most telling sign, she realized, was not the acts themselves, but the way the criminal had used the household's own expectations against them, anticipating reactions, manipulating fear, observing hesitation. Miss Marple called Helena Price into the study, asking her gently to recount what she had observed in the household over the past days. Helena spoke cautiously, her voice low, describing the tension, the arguments, the subtle competitions for attention, favour, and control. As she spoke, Miss Marple's mind focused on the language Helena used, the emphasis on fear, secrecy, and the weight of old grievances. It became clear that the criminal's motive was not merely material or political, it was personal, psychological, a need to assert dominance over those whose past actions had left deep impressions. The realization was sudden but undeniable. The criminal had been driven by a compulsion to right perceived wrongs, to restore balance as they understood it, to assert control over a history they had endured silently for years. Each act, the theft of the photograph, the placement of the cards, the murders, was a piece of a larger ritual of vengeance and psychological satisfaction. It was not greed or simple revenge. It was an intricate obsession with order, memory, and dominance. Miss Marple examined the faces of the household when she next convened them, watching for reactions. Mrs. Fenwick's hands trembled slightly. Helena's eyes darted toward her, and even the maid shifted uneasily. She began to speak, not accusingly, but gently, as if guiding them toward an understanding they might otherwise resist. The crimes committed here, she said, were not driven solely by money or inheritance. They were driven by something far deeper, a need to impose order upon the chaos of past slights, to assert control over those perceived as having wronged the criminal in subtle or sustained ways. It is a psychological pattern, built over years, and expressed now in acts both violent and calculated. She paused, letting the weight of her words settle. The criminal has been among you, moving carefully, leaving faint traces and orchestrating events so that the past would manifest visibly in the present. Each act is a statement, a reflection of long-held grievances, and a compulsive desire to manipulate the household, as if it were a stage upon which their psychological need could be enacted. Cray, tense and impatient, could barely contain his exasperation. But, Miss Marple, this is extraordinary. You mean to say the killer acted not for inheritance, not for spite, but for some sort of obsession? Yes, Inspector, Miss Marple replied, voice calm but resolute. And understanding that obsession is the key, the pattern of behaviour, the deliberate acts, the timing, the manipulation of perception, all of these are expressions of a psychological drive that is far more compelling than any ordinary motive. The criminal is compelled to act, not merely to gain, but to assert control, to satisfy a need long buried and now manifested in these extreme measures. Her gaze swept the room, landing on Mrs. Fenwick with a quiet precision. It is evident to me that this compulsion has been nurtured in secrecy, but it has been expressed in observable ways. Careful placement, subtle rituals, and the orchestration of fear. The criminal has sought, through meticulous acts, to control the narrative, to manipulate the reactions of all around them, and to assert the dominance of their own understanding of justice. The room was silent, the household collectively holding its breath, as if the very air had thickened under the weight of this revelation. Miss Marple continued, "Understanding the psychological compulsion that drives these acts allows us not only to identify the criminal, but also to anticipate the next move. For obsession is consistent. It follows its own logic, even when concealed beneath layers of subterfuge. The criminal has been compelled by a need for dominance, for restoration of perceived order, and that is why the acts have been so deliberate, precise, and chilling." Helena's voice trembled softly. "Then, the criminal is someone who has lived with this need for years, watching, waiting." "Exactly," Miss Marple said, nodding gently. "And that is why each act has been calculated, why evidence has been manipulated, why fear has been used as a tool. It is not random, and it is not merely opportunistic. It is the expression of a mind governed by a hidden compulsion, one that has dictated behavior over decades, and now has manifested in these tragic events." The realization settled in the room like a heavy fog. Miss Marple allowed a moment of quiet before concluding, "The motive is psychological, personal, and deeply rooted. The criminal has acted with method, with care, and with a need to satisfy an inner necessity that outweighs all external considerations. Recognizing this is crucial, for it allows us to interpret the acts not merely as crimes, but as expressions of the mind that orchestrated them, and in doing so, we can move closer to preventing further tragedy." For the first time since the chaos had begun, a sense of clarity emerged. The pattern, the traces, the careful manipulations, all were now illuminated by understanding the driving force behind them. The criminal's psychology had been exposed, revealing a depth and intensity far beyond mere malice, greed, or revenge. And with that understanding, Miss Marple knew the final pieces of the puzzle were within reach. Miss Marple had spent the entire day orchestrating the final steps with meticulous care, each movement deliberate, each word chosen to provoke the right response. She had studied the patterns, the behaviors, the subtle cues left by the criminal, and now, with everything arranged, the trap was ready. The household remained under the pretense of normalcy, though the undercurrent of tension was palpable. Everyone sensed that the climax of the mystery was near. She invited the household into the drawing room under the pretense of reviewing the day's events, carefully arranging the furniture so that each suspect was positioned with subtle psychological effect. Mrs. Fenwick took her customary place near the fireplace, hands clasped tightly. Helena Price perched nervously beside her, while the maid lingered at the edges, her anxiety barely restrained. Even Inspector Cray, unaware of the full design, moved through the room with tense energy, sensing but not understanding the purpose of Miss Marple's calm. At the centre of the room sat the small silver thimble, the letter opener, and the Queen of Hearts, arranged deliberately on a low table. Miss Marple began her discourse in the soft, measured tones that had often disarmed those who underestimated her. "We have observed many curious events over the past days. The removal of the photograph, the second tragic murder, the subtle manipulations, all have followed a pattern, a careful sequence that reveals as much as it conceals." Her eyes swept over the room, noting reactions. Mrs. Fenwick's fingers twitched, Helena shifted uneasily, and the maid glanced down, unable to meet her gaze. Miss Marple allowed the silence to stretch, a delicate weight pressing upon them until it was almost unbearable. "And yet," she continued, "patterns, as we have seen, cannot lie. They reveal truths even when all else is hidden. They expose the mind that moves behind the scenes, the hand that arranges objects, the mind that shapes events to satisfy a hidden need." A faint flush appeared on Mrs. Fenwick's cheeks, and Miss Marple knew she had the attention she required. She leaned forward slightly, hands resting lightly on the table. "The criminal among us is not motivated solely by greed or simple revenge. Their motive is psychological, deeply rooted, a need to assert control over past wrongs and perceived slights. It is this compulsion that guided the removal of the photograph, the precise placement of objects, and the terrible act that claimed Mrs. Lytton's life." There was a stir, a quick intake of breath from Helena, and a subtle shift of weight from Mrs. Fenwick. Miss Marple's eyes met hers directly. "I believe," she said softly, "that the criminal cannot resist revealing themselves when faced with the pattern of their own actions. That is why I have gathered you here, in a room arranged to reflect the sequence, to expose the connections, to bring the past into clear focus." The maid, pale and trembling, whispered under her breath, "It can't be." Miss Marple's gaze, however, remained calm, steady, knowing. She allowed the words to hang in the air, filling the room with anticipation. Then slowly Mrs. Fenwick rose, her composure faltering under the weight of recognition. You cannot know," she said, voice quivering. I was careful. I never meant—" Miss Marple's expression did not change. "I know, because the pattern cannot lie. The thimble, the placement of the letter opener, the subtle scent left behind, even the reactions when the photograph vanished. All these were your signature, Mrs. Fenwick. Your careful attention to detail, your desire to impose order upon the chaos of the past, and your compulsion to control what others could not control, these have revealed you." Mrs. Fenwick's hands shook violently as she stepped backward, nearly losing her balance. I had to," she stammered. They left me no choice. The injustices, the slights, the family. I had to restore balance, to correct what was ignored for too long." Her voice cracked, desperation edging into hysteria. "I could not let it continue. I had to act. I had to." Miss Marple's voice was gentle, steady but firm. "And in acting, you have left a trail that could not be erased. The careful gestures, the hidden objects, the placement of evidence, all were a pattern, a message, and it is a message that leads unerringly to you." Cray stepped forward, though Miss Marple raised a hand, stopping him. "Do not speak yet," she cautioned. "Let her explain herself. Let the compulsion that drove her be revealed fully. That is where understanding lies, and understanding is the key to preventing further tragedy." Mrs. Fenwick's body trembled as she sank into a chair, burying her face in her hands. I never meant to harm more than necessary," she whispered. "Sir Clithering, he deserved exposure for his manipulations. Mrs. Lytton, she knew too much. And the photograph, it would have undone everything. I only acted to control, to restore the balance that had been ignored for decades. I never intended to be a murderer, yet once begun, the acts could not be stopped." The confession, long anticipated by Miss Marple, confirmed the insight she had gained from the patterns, the psychological compulsion, and the subtle behaviours she had observed. Every careful act, every subtle signature, had been an expression of a deeply rooted need for control and order. Mrs. Fenwick's voice rose in sudden hysteria. You don't understand. If it were not done, the chaos would have continued. The balance, everything would have— I had to." She suddenly lunged toward the window, desperation in her eyes, as if escape were the only option. Quick as a flash, Miss Marple rose, moving to intercept her with calm authority. "There is no need, Mrs. Fenwick. The pattern has been revealed, and the consequences can be faced without further harm. The game is finished, but the understanding remains." The maid rushed forward to assist, holding Mrs. Fenwick steady as Inspector Cray finally stepped in to secure her. Miss Marple's eyes softened, not in judgment, but in comprehension of the human psychology that had driven such extreme acts. Here was the culmination of years of hidden grievances, obsessive need for control, and the desire to right perceived wrongs through carefully orchestrated events. As the household slowly exhaled, the tension easing slightly, Miss Marple allowed herself a quiet smile. The trap had been perfect, not because of force or cunning or speed, but because it had relied on the principles that guided all human behaviour: observation, understanding, and patience. The criminal, confident in their meticulous planning, had walked directly into the net woven by their own patterns. She turned to the gathered household, voice calm but resolute. "The danger has passed, and the truth is revealed. What remains now is reflection, comprehension, and the assurance that such actions, however compelling to the mind that orchestrated them, cannot succeed against patient observation and careful reasoning. Inspector Cray, though still shaken, nodded in reluctant admiration. "Miss Marple, I must admit, your method is extraordinary. The precision, the insight, it is remarkable." Miss Marple simply nodded, returning her gaze to the now quiet Mrs. Fenwick, seated and restrained but no longer a threat. "Extraordinary," she murmured, "only in the sense that the ordinary human mind leaves signs, even when it believes it conceals everything, and when those signs are observed with care, the truth, however long hidden, will always emerge." The household, finally settling into a quiet, reflective stillness, seemed to breathe again. The final confrontation had revealed not only the criminal, but the intricate psychology that had driven every act, every subtle manipulation, every tragic consequence. And Miss Marple, as always, remained composed, the final piece of the puzzle now secure in her steady understanding of human nature. The household had begun to settle into a fragile calm. Mrs. Fenwick, restrained and subdued, sat quietly in the drawing-room, while Inspector Cray recorded the final details of the confession. The air, once heavy with fear and suspicion, seemed lighter, almost deceptively so. Miss Marple allowed herself a quiet sigh, assuming that the intricate web of crimes, motives and patterns had finally been unravelled. The pattern had emerged, the criminal identified, the psychological compulsion exposed. Yet, deep in the back of her mind, a small, nagging uncertainty refused to be silenced. It began with a detail so minute that she almost overlooked it, a folded scrap of paper peeking from beneath the table where the Queen of Hearts had been displayed during the final confrontation. The maid, in her nervous haste, had failed to notice it, and even the inspector, focused on Mrs. Fenwick's confession, had overlooked it entirely. Miss Marple picked it up, noting the handwriting, unfamiliar, precise, and careful. It was not Mrs. Fenwick's script, nor anyone she had observed actively participating in the manipulations. The ink was fresh, the fold deliberate, the content cryptic but suggestive, a single line scrawled in careful cursive, "Not all ends here." A shiver ran down Miss Marple's spine, not of fear, but of recognition. Patterns were rarely complete at the first glance. Just as Mrs. Fenwick had left traces that revealed her compulsion, so too could another mind have left subtle signs that hinted at deeper orchestration. The final confession might have been genuine, but could it have been manipulated, staged to divert attention from someone else? She studied the faces around her. Helena Price sat uneasily, glancing at Mrs. Fenwick, then at the thimble still on the table. The maid fidgeted, nervously wringing her hands, while the inspector scribbled notes, unaware that he had just passed over the potential significance of the paper. Miss Marple's keen eyes caught the slight flicker of interest in Helena's gaze, not curiosity about the confession itself, but a careful, almost imperceptible calculation, a mental tallying of the implications. Miss Marple's mind traced the sequence again: the first murder, the missing photograph, the placement of the cards, the second murder, and the confession. Everything had seemed to fit neatly into a pattern of obsession and compulsion, but now she wondered, had someone guided Mrs. Fenwick's hand, intentionally or subtly, ensuring that she would commit acts that revealed a plausible, if incomplete, picture? Could the obsessive patterns themselves have been a smokescreen, drawing attention while another mind moved behind the scenes? She decided to test her suspicion. With deliberate calm, she arranged for all the household to remain in the drawing-room, claiming she wished to review the timeline of events for the inspector's records. As she narrated each act, she subtly observed reactions: the twitch of an eyelid, a brief tightening of a fist, a fleeting glance toward a hidden corner. Helena's movements, so careful before, now betrayed the slightest hesitation, a micro-expression Miss Marple had learned to recognize as a signal of concealment or anxiety. When she reached the discussion of the second murder, she paused and allowed her eyes to rest on Helena. "It is remarkable," she said softly, "how carefully some events are orchestrated, even when a mind believes itself to be clever. Patterns, as we have seen, reveal not only action but intention, and sometimes What seems to be the work of one hand is influenced, guided, or even initiated by another. Helena stiffened, almost imperceptibly, but enough for Miss Marple to notice. She leaned slightly forward, voice gentle, almost conversational. "Tell me, Helena, did you ever feel compelled to influence events even subtly? Did you ever, perhaps unintentionally, guide another's actions in ways that would serve your own ends?" Helena's eyes widened, the first real crack appearing in her composed exterior. I don't know what you mean," she said quickly, voice tight. But Miss Marple's keen observation noted the avoidance, the slight turning away, the half-step backward, the tiny flush creeping up her neck. Miss Marple allowed the moment to linger, letting the tension build just enough to elicit the next signal. Then she spoke more firmly. "Mrs. Fenwick acted with compulsive need, yes, but even compulsions can be steered. Someone who understands patterns, someone careful and observant, could anticipate that compulsion and guide it. Place subtle suggestions, leave tiny indications, direct attention, enough to shape the outcome without being seen. Could it be that the final acts, the confession, the behaviours we observed, were in part orchestrated by another mind entirely?" The room was silent. Helena's hands trembled slightly as she clasped them together. The maid's eyes darted between Helena and Mrs. Fenwick. Inspector Cray frowned, finally sensing the shift in the atmosphere, though he could not yet see the thread Miss Marple had traced. Helena's composure broke. I didn't mean, I only wanted," her voice faltered, barely audible. "I never intended for murder. But I saw what could happen, and I guided her subtly. She was capable, but the pattern, I wanted it to appear as though she acted alone, as though the compulsion alone drove her. I didn't expect it to go so far." Miss Marple's eyes softened, not in pity, but in understanding. "Your guidance, subtle though it may have been, shaped the outcome. Yet the compulsive patterns of Mrs. Fenwick remained present. Her own need to control, to assert order, to act upon perceived injustices. Your influence only aligned with what was already set in motion by her mind. That is why the traces remained visible, why the thimble, the scent, the careful placement of objects, all still pointed to her compulsion." Helena sank into a chair, pale and shaken. "I thought I could manage it, that I could direct it without anyone being harmed. But I underestimated everything." Miss Marple leaned back, reflecting. "Human minds, even those with the best intentions, are not always capable of controlling compulsions once set in motion. Patterns will emerge, and the truth, no matter how concealed, will always leave a trace. You acted, consciously or unconsciously, as a guide, but the ultimate acts were still driven by compulsive needs, and the pattern, though now more complex, still revealed its course." Inspector Cray finally stepped forward, astonishment and frustration in equal measure. "So the case isn't over? Even after the confession, the pattern, the motive?" "Cases," Miss Marple said softly, "are never as simple as they seem. A confession may reveal part of the truth. A pattern may illuminate action, but the minds behind events are often layered. One mind acts, another guides, and yet another observes. Understanding each layer is essential to truly seeing the whole picture." The room remained tense, the final twist settling like a shadow across the household. Mrs. Fenwick's compulsions had driven her to murder. Helena had guided and manipulated subtly, thinking herself clever, and Miss Marple, patient as ever, had observed both, tracing the complex weave that had created the tragedy. The criminality was layered, and the genius of the detective was tested, not in simply identifying a culprit, but in untangling the multiple threads of influence, compulsion, and subtle orchestration. Miss Marple rose slowly, eyes sweeping the room with calm authority. "The pattern is complete only when all the threads are visible. What we believed to be the conclusion was merely a chapter. The final understanding emerges only when we acknowledge both the compulsions that drive acts and the subtle hands that guide them. The truth, in all its complexity, has now been revealed." The household exhaled, some with relief, some with dread, as the last-minute twist settled fully into place. Miss Marple, seated quietly once more, allowed a small smile to touch her lips. The mystery, intricate and deceptive, had tested her patient's perception and understanding to its limits. But in the end, even the most convoluted patterns could be read by those willing to observe, listen, and think with care. The air in the drawing-room had grown heavy with a quiet that was both uneasy and resolute. Mrs. Fenwick, restrained and subdued, now understood the consequences of her compulsions, while Helena Price's pale, trembling figure revealed the weight of her subtle manipulations. Miss Marple, seated by the window, allowed the late afternoon light to filter across her thoughtful face, reflecting the clarity of mind that had guided her through the intricate maze of events. Though the household believed the mystery concluded, she knew that true resolution required careful attention to every final detail. She began by addressing the assembled group, her tone calm but precise. The events of these past days have been complex, and the truth, as we have now seen, is layered. Mrs. Fenwick's compulsions led to acts that were tragic, yet predictable in their patterns. Helena's interventions, subtle though they were, guided those actions and shaped perception. The combination of these two influences created a sequence that nearly obscured the truth entirely. Inspector Cray, still flustered, scribbled notes furiously, but Miss Marple allowed herself a moment to clarify the final, often overlooked details. There are objects, traces, and gestures that most people dismiss as incidental. The silver thimble, dented yet polished, indicated habitual care and careful planning. The Queen of Hearts beneath the stair carpet was a deliberate distraction, designed to mislead attention while the photograph was removed. Even the faint scent of lavender left unconsciously by Mrs. Fenwick marked her presence and her compulsion, but it also contained the subtle hint of another hand, guiding, shaping, nudging. She leaned forward slightly, voice softening, inviting reflection rather than fear. The clues that were missed initially were small, almost trivial in appearance, yet they formed a sequence that, when read carefully, revealed the interplay of influence. The first murder, the vanishing photograph, the second tragic death. Each was a move on a board of human psychology. Observing reactions, patterns, and minute gestures is what allowed us to see the fuller picture. Mrs. Fenwick's head hung low, and Helena avoided her gaze. Miss Marple's eyes, however, were steady, absorbing every flicker of acknowledgement or denial. "It is important to understand," she continued, "that patterns reveal not just actions but intentions. One could act compulsively, yet be guided, consciously or unconsciously, by another. That duality created a sequence that was nearly undetectable, yet left enough subtle markers for careful observation to uncover." She gestured toward the table where the objects, thimble, letter opener, and cards, still lay. Each item was a signature, a trace of human behavior. The thimble spoke of compulsion and care, the letter opener of intention, the Queen of Hearts of diversion. To the untrained eye they were incidental, mere curiosities, but the observant mind recognizes their purpose, to conceal, to reveal, and to guide perception. Inspector Cray finally lifted his gaze, brow furrowed. "Miss Marple, are you saying that even after the confession there were still hidden aspects, that the truth was not entirely captured in what we saw?" Miss Marple nodded gently. "Precisely. Justice is more than assigning guilt. It is understanding the full scope of influence, motive, and consequence. Mrs. Fenwick's acts were real, and she will face the appropriate consequences. Helena's guidance, subtle though it was, must also be recognized, for it shaped the unfolding of events and ensured that the narrative seemed complete before it truly was." She allowed a brief silence to settle, then spoke with quiet authority. "The ultimate lesson here is that human behavior, even when calculated, leaves traces. Some are obvious, others nearly imperceptible. Observing, interpreting, and linking these traces is how the truth emerges, and it is why, even when events appear closed, patient observation can reveal the layers beneath." The room remained still, each person digesting the implications. Miss Marple's voice softened as she turned to the final, uncomfortable reality. Yet, even with understanding and insight, not all questions are answered. Some motives remain partially obscured, some influences unacknowledged. Human minds are complex, and actions often ripple beyond what we see. Justice can be served in terms of legal consequence, but the full tapestry of influence and psychology is never entirely reducible to law. She looked toward Helena, whose expression was a mixture of fear and reluctant recognition. "The subtle guidance you provided," Miss Marple said, "though intended perhaps to shape events without harm, must now be considered as part of the moral equation. The law may address acts directly committed, but understanding intent and influence adds depth to the concept of accountability." Mrs. Fenwick, her hands still trembling, whispered, "So, justice, is it truly done?" Miss Marple's eyes were steady, reflective. Legally, yes, Mrs. Fenwick will answer for her actions, but psychologically, ethically, we recognize that influence and compulsion intertwined to produce tragedy. That complexity is why it is necessary to observe, to think, and to understand the full context of human behavior. Justice, therefore, is not merely punishment. It is comprehension, a measure of insight, and an acknowledgement of all forces at play. Inspector Cray exhaled, his shoulders loosening slightly, yet the furrow on his brow remained. "And the clues we missed, the subtle gestures, the minor objects, those are what gave you the insight, Miss Marple?" She nodded, a faint smile touching her lips. "Yes, Inspector. Every overlooked object, every tiny reaction, every almost imperceptible shift in tone or posture contributed to understanding. They are reminders that what seems trivial may, in fact, be essential, and that human behavior, even when hidden, cannot escape observation entirely." She glanced once more at the drawing room, noting the lingering tension and relief intertwined in the household. Some threads of influence remain beyond the reach of legal consequence, some motives continue to echo silently. But awareness, understanding, and careful observation illuminate what would otherwise remain concealed. That is why patience and perception are crucial in the pursuit of truth. As the sun dipped behind the distant hills, casting long shadows across the room, the household felt the finality of the day's revelations. Justice had been served in terms of accountability, yet the shadow of influence lingered, an unsettling reminder that human behavior is rarely linear or simple. The pattern had emerged fully, the hidden motives revealed, and the subtle manipulations acknowledged. But some elements of the story, as Miss Marple knew, would continue to whisper in the spaces between actions, leaving an uneasy sense of unfinished business. Miss Marple allowed herself a quiet moment of satisfaction, not in triumph, but in comprehension. The mystery had been unravelled, the criminal identified, and the psychological web laid bare. Yet the truth, like human nature, remained layered, complex, and eternally instructive. In the careful observation of objects, gestures, and subtle patterns, she had once again proven that insight, patience, and understanding can illuminate even the most intricate of human deceptions. The household had quieted, the oppressive tension gradually replaced by the tentative calm of resolution. Mrs. Fenwick, her compulsions exposed, sat silently, staring at the floor, while Helena Price remained pale and unsteady, caught between fear and reluctant acknowledgement of her part in the chain of events. Inspector Cray had retreated to his notes, muttering observations under his breath, still trying to absorb the intricacies of Miss Marple's layered revelations. Miss Marple herself moved slowly to the window, her gaze drifting across the moor, the wind stirring the heather as though it carried whispers from some hidden corner of the world. Even as the immediate danger had passed, Miss Marple felt that subtle, familiar tug at the edge of her consciousness, a faint sense that the puzzle, while largely solved, was not yet entirely complete. She allowed herself to reflect on the small, seemingly inconsequential details she had noted throughout the investigation. A folded scrap of paper with a cryptic warning, a fleeting look exchanged between two servants, the subtle scent of lavender that lingered too long after it should have faded. Each, taken individually, had offered no clue. Yet now, after the revelation of compulsions and subtle manipulations, They pressed against the edges of her awareness, demanding consideration. Walking slowly through the drawing room, she paused at the low table where the objects, thimble, letter opener, Queen of Hearts, still rested. She examined them once more, not for clues to the identity of the criminal, which had already been revealed, but for nuance, for something that had been overlooked in the surge of events and revelations. And there it was, a faint smudge on the underside of the thimble, invisible until held against the afternoon light. A fingerprint, almost imperceptible, yet not belonging to Mrs. Fenwick or Helena. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. A trace, left by someone else, someone observing, perhaps manipulating even further behind the scenes. Her mind wandered through the timelines, the confessions, the gestures and compulsions she had painstakingly untangled. Everything fit into a pattern, yes, but patterns can be deceptive, and small anomalies often hint at hidden layers. The smudge suggested a presence she had not accounted for, a shadow lurking just beyond the obvious, and a faint smile curved her lips as she realized the familiar truth. Even a seemingly concluded case rarely ends entirely. There are always threads that extend beyond immediate perception, always whispers of influence, subtle movements that escape notice until later. She moved quietly toward the window again, allowing her eyes to follow the winding paths of the moor, the heather bending in waves as though carrying secrets just out of reach. The inspector, noticing her stillness, approached cautiously. "Miss Marple, is it over now?" he asked, voice edged with curiosity and exhaustion. "Legally," she said softly, "the immediate matters are resolved. Those who committed acts will answer for them, and the household can begin to recover. But justice in the moral, psychological and practical sense is never entirely complete. There are always remnants, subtle signals, threads that hint at further mysteries." Cray frowned. "Remnants? You mean someone else?" Miss Marple did not answer directly. Instead, she let her gaze rest on the folded scrap of paper she had retrieved from beneath the table, now held lightly in her fingers. The words, "Not all ends here," pressed against her mind in quiet insistence. It could be a warning, a leftover mischief, or an intentional message from a mind still unexposed. Whatever its origin, it carried a weight she could not ignore. Some questions she knew were not answered immediately. They required patience, careful observation, and a readiness to recognize subtle patterns when they resurfaced. She turned her attention back to the household. Mrs. Fenwick, now under formal restraint, sat with a quiet resignation, while Helena's trembling fingers fidgeted nervously. The maid, pale but attentive, hovered at the edges, and Inspector Cray remained focused on documenting the events, unaware of the deeper currents Miss Marple had begun to perceive. She allowed herself a moment to consider human behaviour, the interplay of compulsion, influence, and subtle guidance that had produced the tragedies, confessions, and revelations. Nothing is ever quite as it seems. There are always layers waiting to be uncovered. Miss Marple walked slowly down the hallway toward the front door, her footsteps light but deliberate. She paused once, turning back to glance at the drawing room, at the stillness of the household, at the faint traces of lives unsettled. She spoke softly, almost to herself, though the words carried enough weight for anyone listening. "The world is full of small mysteries, of hidden motives and subtle manipulations. Some are solved quickly, others reveal themselves only after time has passed, and the mind remains alert, and some never truly end." Outside, the wind had risen, carrying with it the scent of wet earth and heather, a cool reminder of the world beyond the house. Miss Marple stepped onto the gravel path, letting her gaze sweep across the hills, the distant trees, and the shifting clouds. The scrap of paper in her pocket, the faint smudge on the thimble, the unaccounted glances and gestures, they all hinted at another story waiting just beyond perception. The case had reached its formal conclusion, yes, but the mind that observes, the eye that notices, knows that threads may extend indefinitely, that shadows can linger, and that the human heart is rarely straightforward. As she walked away, the sunlight began to fade, painting the moor in long, soft shadows. Miss Marple's figure moved steadily, the very image of composure and quiet intelligence. She did not look back. but her mind catalogued every nuance, every subtle anomaly. The cases she pursued were rarely simple, rarely complete, but always instructive. And in that realization lay her satisfaction. The mystery, though partially resolved, had revealed enough to sharpen her insight, to strengthen her understanding of human nature, and to prepare her for the puzzles yet to come. The household remained behind, subdued yet unsettled, aware that though immediate justice had been delivered, the final whispers of influence and hidden motives had not vanished entirely. Somewhere within the quiet, within the lingering shadows and overlooked details, another story waited, and Miss Marple, as always, would be ready. Her steps carried her away from the house, down the gravel path, over the hills, and into the wind that whispered secrets across the moor. And though the world appeared calm, she knew, as she often did, that mysteries never truly end. There were always details unnoticed, messages unspoken, and patterns yet to be fully revealed. And for a mind such as hers, that knowledge was not unsettling. It was the invitation to continue observing, to continue thinking, and to continue unraveling the endless, fascinating enigmas of human nature.